Welcome back. In the last session, we looked at the final parables of the Gospel of Matthew. We began with the parable of the 10 maidens, 5 of whom were foolish and 5 of whom were wise. Then we moved to a discussion of the parable of the talents, showing the necessity of using what God has given to us, even if we have to risk losing it. Finally, we looked at the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is Matthew's account of the Last Judgment. We saw how we will be judged on how well we have cared for our fellow human being, in particular, our practice of what has come to be known as the corporal works of mercy. In our current session, we shall look at the Passion narrative as it's presented by Matthew. As with our discussion of the other Passion narratives, in the opinion of Raymond E. Brown, we will divide it into 4 major parts with 4 subsections. The 4 major parts are the Gethsemane Scene with Jesus and his disciples, the Jewish or the Sanhedrin Trial, the Roman trial before Pilate, and the crucifixion, including the Via Dolorosa. Each of these, according to Brown, has a subsection connected with it. The Gethsemane scene leads naturally into the arrest of Jesus. The Jewish trial is concurrent with the denial of Peter. The Roman trial introduces the personage Barabbas, a robber, whom the crowds choose for release over Jesus. The crucifixion scene is concluded with the narrative of the burial of Jesus and the sealing of the tomb. One may ask, where is the Last Supper? Much of the material on the Last Supper Luke has drawn from the Gospel of Mark. And so in the interest of time and repetition, I would refer you to the 13th session of the Gospel of Mark series, in particular the end of that session. In fact, with the Passion narrative itself, a significant portion of the material has been discussed in the programs on Mark and Luke. Although there will be some repetition here, for the most part, I intend on concentrating on what is most particularly Matthean in the Passion narrative. So, following Brown's outline of the Passion narrative, we begin with the Gethsemane scene. Here, Matthew follows the Markan narrative very closely, but he does introduce some editorial changes. The name Gethsemane derives from the Hebrew or the Aramaic Gath Semanim, which is generally translated winepress. Arnold notes then that Gethsemane was a garden area among the olive tree groves on the Mount of Olives, where a place for the preparation of olive oil was located. The text begins simply noting that Jesus went with them, the disciples, to this place of the winepress, Gethsemane. Here is a map of the city of Jerusalem as it was thought to be in the time of Jesus. The Garden of Gethsemane is marked by the oval toward the right of the map about 1/3 of the way from the top. It's on the opposite side of the Mount of Olives from the city and the temple. A second oval marks the Cenaculum, which is traditionally thought to be the room where the Last Supper was celebrated. You'll notice that Jesus and the disciples pretty much crossed from one side of the city to the other, going from the Cenaculum to Gethsemane. Finally, we have a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane as it exists today. Several of these olive trees are thought to come from a time close to that of Christ. But because of the significant destruction by the Romans in AD 70, probably they do not date back to the time of Christ. Upon entering the garden, Jesus commands the disciples to sit here while I go and pray. Then he takes Peter, James, and John, leaving the other 8, With these special three, Jesus allows his feelings of what is most certainly about to unfold to surface. My soul is sorrowful even unto death, he says. Then he commands them as he commanded the others. Remain here and keep watch with me. The language is telling. Keep watch in Greek is gregoreo. It's the very word that was used in several parts of the apocalyptic discourse describing the stance of the believer in the face of the end times. Then, going a little further, he fell on his face and prayed. This is a picture of the interior of the Church of All Nations, built beside the Garden of Gethsemane. In the center of the sanctuary is a rather large rock, pictured here, which was thought to be the rock at which Jesus prayed to his Father on the final night of his life on earth. To this day, pilgrims come from all over the world to pray at this site. The content of Jesus' prayer follows. My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. As we have seen earlier in the gospel, cup is a metaphor for the suffering and death that Jesus was going to soon face. He prays that if it might be possible, that he not go through or go the route of the cross. However, if it's necessary and there is no other way, he will do it. Not as I will, but as thou wilt. We see in this simple prayer the essence of all Christian prayer. It's an implicit prayer that the will of God be done. Once he has offered his prayer, he returns to Peter, James, and John, and he finds them asleep. They've not heeded his command to remain awake and pray. They have, in essence, left him totally alone in this moment of sorrow and distress. They've let him down. He addresses his remarks to Peter, again signifying the position of prominence of Peter among the disciples. So, could you not then watch 1 hour with me? There's that verb gregoreo again. They fail to stay awake. They fail to keep watch. So he tries again, commanding, watch and pray, with the purpose of not entering into temptation, that is, entering into the test. This pertains not so much to the immediate situation at hand, but to the situation of the disciples after the events of the next few days have played out. They will be on their own, and they will be bombarded by temptations. How do they survive? They must stay awake, be on guard, be watchful, and above all, pray. What a good lesson for us also. Jesus continues, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus seemingly understands that they want to do what he requests, but their bodies are so worn out that they will not cooperate. Hagner sees it as a tension between the inner person, the center of volition or will, and the outer person, the bodily flesh with more inherent weakness. It's an interesting aside that some translators prefer to make this statement a response of Peter to Jesus. However, there's no indication that the speaker has changed. So, having expressed his feelings once again, Jesus returns to his prayer. The prayer is repeated almost verbatim. Then he returns to the disciples a second time to find them sleeping. This time he says nothing to them, simply observes and returns to his prayer for a third time, only to return and find them sleeping a third time. This certainly must have been a letdown. In either the form of a question or an exasperation, Jesus says, "Are you still sleeping, taking your rest?" In other words, are you so tired that you have no time for the crisis that I'm facing? That exasperation is then furthered. Look, the hour has come. They won't be able to stay asleep because the arrest party is drawing near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Using phraseology for the Passion that he has used throughout the Gospel, Jesus announces that it's beginning. So there's no longer time for sleep. They must rise and be going. The betrayer is at hand. What he had warned them in the course of the Last Supper is now occurring, and they must face it. The first subsection is introduced by a reference to the preceding. While he was still speaking. Then the demonstrative particle, behold, or lo and behold, introduces the approach of Judas, who was identified as one of the 12. He comes with a great crowd armed with swords and clubs. They're identified as being sent with Judas from the chief priests and the elders, the ruling authorities of the Jews. Clearly, the size and the armament of this crowd demonstrates that they felt that they would meet with considerable opposition in their attempt to arrest Jesus. With this arrest taking place under the cover of darkness, there's need that they be certain of arresting the right person. As a result, Judas has prearranged for the arrest party a signal. The one whom Judas shall kiss is the one whom they are to seize and arrest. Judas then immediately draws near him. Kyrie Rabbi, hail Master, or hail Rabbi. Then he kisses Jesus. Harrington points out that the greeting and the kiss were primarily signs of respect of a disciple to his master. Secondarily, do they signal friendship? But here, they're not signs of respect, but rather they have become the sign of betrayal. Beside one of the side altars in the Church of All Nations at the Garden of Gethsemane, this moment of betrayal is remembered by a mosaic of Judas giving Jesus the kiss. The Latin inscription below the mosaic gives the response of Jesus to the kiss. Friend, to what purpose have you come? And then links it with the statement of Jesus from the Gospel of Luke. Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Luke 22:48. Judas addresses Jesus as Rabbi, and Jesus responds addressing Judas as friend. No sooner has this been said than the arrest party moves into action. They lay hands on Jesus and they seize him. But the disciples who are with Jesus will not allow this to happen. Again, the particle, behold, or lo and behold, one of those with Jesus, having stretched out his hand, drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. It's possible that the disciples intended to inflict a more serious harm on the servant. Certainly, were the servant involved in cultic service, the mutilation of the ear would render him unable to perform such service. Jesus is quick to respond to the disciple. He tells him to put the sword away. Put the sword back in its place, he says, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. This is a proverbial way of saying that violence begets violence. This reaction of Jesus is understandable based on what he had taught his disciples in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Offer no resistance to the one who is evil. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other one as well." Matthew 5:39. So taking a sword to a servant in the arrest party is not an answer. In fact, swords are not needed. Jesus, as Son of Man, could call upon the Father and he would send 12 legions of angels to protect them against the arrest party. Hagner comments that this is quite a large number of angels that he can call, as one legion in the Roman army comprised 6,000 men. So 12 legions would be 72,000 angels. But Jesus must continue doing the will of the Father. So calling upon such a vast army of angels would certainly be unnecessary. The scriptures must be fulfilled that show that this must be. He must die. God has ordained that things should be thus. Since hagiography, the scriptures reflect the will of God, they must be fulfilled. Jesus now shifts his attention to the arrest party, described as the crowds. At that time, literally at that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me?" This is his comment on the size of the group and the armament of the group. They're out as though they're apprehending a violent revolutionary against the state. They've had several chances in the past few days, when day after day Jesus was with them in the temple teaching. But they did no such thing. Now, in the cover of darkness, on a night when people are supposed to be with their families celebrating the Passover, they come to apprehend him. Then, invoking the fulfillment of scriptures a second time, Matthew records the fact that the disciples left him and fled. The disciples who earlier promised that if necessary they would die with him, Matthew 26:35, who slept in the garden as he wrestled with his feelings before the Father, now, when he's apprehended, flee, forsaking Jesus. Now we move to the second part of the Passion narrative, the Sanhedrin Trial, or the Jewish trial. Throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we've seen that the Jewish leaders have become more and more belligerent toward Jesus, and that belligerence now leads them to hold a secret hearing on the eve of Passover in order to declare him worthy of death and get him out of their workings permanently. The arrest party immediately led Jesus back across the city to the house of Caiphas, who was the high priest for that year. The scribes and the elders were assembled there. Now, this is most unusual, as the official proceedings of the scribes and Pharisees and the elders, that is the Sanhedrin, are supposed to take place in the chamber of the hewn stone in the temple area, not the house of the high priest. Further, such gatherings would never be conducted on such a high holy day or holiday. Both of these show how determined the Sanhedrin was to eliminate Jesus. Again, we have our map of the city of Jerusalem. As we have seen, the arrest took place in the Garden of Gethsemane, designated by this oval. The ruins of the house of the high priest Caiphas are generally thought to be under the current church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, designated by this oval. For orientation, this blue oval is located at the cenaculum, which we saw earlier. So Jesus was now led back across practically the same route he traveled with the disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a picture of what archaeologists think the Palace of Caiphas may have looked like. It's located in the model of the city of Jerusalem of 66 AD, which is housed in the Israel Museum today. The walls at the bottom of the picture are the walls of the city of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. This is the southwest corner of the city. Moving from the model of Jerusalem in 66 AD to the present day, we see a rather large church standing on the site. It's the church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. The church is built on the side of a hill, over the ruins of what many consider the house of Caiphas. It gets its name from the event of Peter's denial which took place at the house of Caiphas. Recall that Jesus told Peter at the Last Supper that before the cock, gallus in Latin, would crow, canto in Latin, Peter would deny Jesus 3 times. Hence, Gallicantu would be a Latinized version of cockcrow. So the church is known as St. Peter's at Cockcrow. Toward the rear of the church, the lower church, the crypt church, we find a number of rock formations. These are thought to be the ruins of the house of Caiphas. Murphy O'Connor recalls some Christians venerate the site as the house of the high priest Caiphas, to which Jesus was taken after his arrest, and where Peter denied him. Enough traces have been found to demonstrate the existence of a monastic church of the 6th century, which a very late document, circa 675 AD, identifies as the place where Peter went after his betrayal. For the time being, we'll skip verse 58, which pertains to the account of Peter's denial. Some scholars feel that once Judas had approached the chief priests and the authorities with the possibility of facilitating Jesus being handed over, the Sanhedrin began to amass a case against him. But clearly things happened in a very quick manner, and so they probably were still preparing the case in hopes of putting him to death. But they were not being very successful. They could not find any testimony, much less sufficient testimony, to convict Jesus. As a result, they, in another manifestation of how desperate they were now seeking any kind of testimony, whether it be verifiable or not. The witnesses they could amass bore false witness. However, in the end, 2 witnesses come forward who seemingly were not false, and they declared, "This man said, I can destroy the temple of God and within 3 days rebuild it." This testimony brings quite a serious charge against Jesus. To speak against the temple was treasonous and could be worthy of death. So now the time comes for Jesus to defend himself. So the high priest asks whether he has anything to say in his defense. "Have you no answer to make?" Jesus keeps silent. This may be well in line with Isaiah 53:7. Like a lamb led before the slaughter, or a sheep silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. With Jesus being silent, the high priest goes on the offensive. "I adjure you by the living God." This is a shorthand in Jewish court procedure for what we say in our courts. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Thus Jesus is solemnly put under oath. Then comes the high priest's question. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the living God?" Jesus now breaks his silence and gives what many consider a positive answer. "You have said so." But even this, the high priest does not have enough. But even with this, the high priest does not have enough to charge Jesus with blasphemy. Clearly, on the basis of Psalm 2, as we saw earlier in the Gospel, the Messiah was considered an adopted Son of God from the day of his anointing as Messiah. But Jesus continues, citing Daniel 7:14. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, to which he joins Psalm 110:2, coming on the clouds of heaven. He has, in essence, identified himself as more than the Messiah, as merely a human agent. Rather, he is the one who is given dominion and glory and kingship, whom all serve, and whose kingdom will see no end. The one who sits at the right hand of God. Psalm 110:1. Now this is what the high priest has been waiting for. Jesus has taken unto himself prerogatives that belong to God alone. And so he tears his garments, a symbolic act of mourning in the Old Testament, exclaiming, "He has blasphemed." What further need is there of witnesses? The Sanhedrin has heard his blasphemy. But there's a problem. The Mishnah, Tractate Sanhedrin 7:5, states that the requirement for blasphemy is the utterance of the divine name. He who blasphemes, it says, is liable only when he shall fully pronounce the divine name. Jesus has not done that. So, is he liable? In the high priest's mind, wishing to put an end to Jesus, he is. So he asks them, "What's your opinion?" The Sanhedrin replies, "He deserves to die." So they have what they wanted. But has it been legitimately, legally attained? Having found him worthy of death, they proceed to treat him like a criminal, spitting upon him and striking him. He claimed to be a prophet, so let him act like a prophet now. Okay, prophet, prophesy, Messiah. Tell us who struck you. Matthew does not mention it explicitly, but it is presumed, as in the other gospel accounts, that Jesus at this point is blindfolded. They treat him as they consider him, a charlatan who deserves no respect. As Jesus is being questioned, condemned, and mocked inside the house of the high priest, Peter, who had followed at a distance after the other disciples had fled, is now warming himself outside with the servants and the servant girls of the high priest. This becomes the context for the denial of Jesus. We begin the account of Peter's denial with verse 58, which we skipped. In that verse, we're told that Peter was following the arrest party at a distance, all the way to the courtyard of the high priest's house. Matthew adds that Peter is waiting to see the outcome, literally the end, tautelos in Greek. We could say he's waiting to see how this would end. After the narrative of the trial, Matthew rejoins Peter in the courtyard. The effect of mentioning Peter at verse 58 is to frame the Jewish trial scene with the scene of Peter's denial. Following Mark, Matthew sets up the dichotomy of Jesus inside affirming his status as Son of God, and Peter outside denying any connection with Jesus. Peter is still sitting with the guards, warming himself, when a maidservant approaches him and declares, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." Her identification of Jesus means that she must have been part of the arrest party, or she may have been among the crowds who witnessed the teaching of Jesus in Jerusalem in the previous days. Peter, now fearing that he's being identified with Jesus, and that identification may bring on the same fate for him as was playing out for Jesus, emphatically, before all, denies it. I do not know what you are talking about. This denial is quite surprising, as just a few hours earlier, Peter had said to Jesus that he would go even to death if necessary. Strange things happen when push comes to shove. This is a picture of one of the representations of Peter's denial that are located at the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. It shows the Roman soldier, the maidservant, and Peter, with the inscription Non Novi Illum, translated, I do not know the man. Seemingly, trying to get out of the spotlight, Peter now moves out to the porch, where presumably there are less people. Yet he immediately runs into another maidservant. She recognizes him and declares, this man was with Jesus the Nazarene. Peter again denies, only this time he does it with an oath. I do not know the man. Not only was he not associated with Jesus the Nazarene, he doesn't even have any knowledge of him whatsoever. So he says. As Hagner points out, Jesus, the Son of Man, has become for Peter, his prime disciple, merely the man. Thinking that he may now be in the clear, Peter breathes a sigh of relief, and there is no further identification for quite a while. But then, some more of the bystanders approach and recognize Peter. You too were one of them. How do they know? He doesn't speak like the people of Jerusalem. He speaks like a northerner, a Galilean. In fact, there was something quite distinct about the Galilean dialect of Aramaic and the Galilean accent. Peter's very voice and accent have given him away. Peter, feeling that he now may be cornered, becomes even more vehement in his denial of Jesus. He invokes a curse and swears, I do not know the man. In cursing and swearing, Peter invokes the wrath of God on himself, if what he says is not true. Matthew then very simply announces, immediately the cock crowed. In the crypt of the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, to the left of the main altar, there is a fresco of Peter denying Jesus, which we see in this picture. Again, the inscription is the Latin phrase non novi illum, I do not know the man. Upon hearing the cock crow, Peter's memory is jarred, and he recalls the prediction that Jesus had made at the Last Supper. Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Ironically, it was in response to this prediction that Peter made his statement that he would rather go to death with Jesus than deny him. Realizing what he has done, Peter leaves the high priest's courtyard and weeps bitterly. Behind the main altar in the crypt church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, we have the mosaic of Peter weeping, depicted here. It's interesting at this point to make a comparison between Judas, who betrayed Jesus, and Peter, who denied him. Both have significantly left Jesus down. However, Judas feels that what he has done is so bad that there's no hope for forgiveness. He therefore goes out and hangs himself. Peter, on the other hand, realizes his wrong, yet never gives up hope. He goes out and weeps bitterly, but still he trusts that Jesus can and will forgive him. This Jesus does at the resurrection, when he asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter responds, "You know, Lord, that I love you." The mosaic on the altar at the left side of the crypt tells that part of the story. The inscription in Latin, Dominus te omnia nostri, tu scis quia amo te, translates as, "Lord, you know everything, or all things. You know that I love you." So despite his denial, Peter never ceased loving Jesus, and Jesus never ceased loving him. What a wonderful lesson there is in that contrast between Peter and Judas for us. No matter what we do, we cannot lose hope, because Christ never ceases to love us. Well, that's about all the time we have for this session. Next time, we'll finish the Passion narrative with the discussion of the Roman trial and the release of Barabbas, the Via Dolorosa, the crucifixion, and the burial of Jesus. See you then.